Hi everyone, hope you're doing well. Today's lecture for POL 102 is going to be on the bureaucracy, corresponding to chapter 12 in your book. So, what is the bureaucracy? This is a group within the executive branch, actually a whole lot of groups that exist to implement and enforce public policy pursuant to laws that are passed. So what are we going to talk about today? First of all, we'll talk about what the bureaucracy does in more detail. Just based on what I've told you in the intro, maybe you're still a bit confused. We'll get into the specifics of what the functions of the bureaucracy are. Following that, we'll talk about how it's organized. Then we'll get a little bit of history showing how it's expanded over time, and then discuss what the modern bureaucracy looks like in the contemporary period. After that, we'll start talking a little bit about, given these tasks that the bureaucracy has and its structure, what are some potential issues that arise. Uh, it's not a body that functions perfectly, the bureaucracy. Sometimes people have issues with it, sometimes it has issues that it creates for itself. What are these? Then to close, we'll have a section to discuss, given these issues, what are the available approaches to oversight and reform that can help to improve the way the bureaucracy works. Alright, to start out, let's talk more about what the bureaucracy does. The primary task, as I just said in the introduction, is to implement and enforce laws. So, as we've talked about so far, Congress writes laws. The president has the ability to either sign or veto a law. Typically, if a law goes into effect, it's as a result of the president signing it. We talked about veto overrides being quite rare. Oftentimes, the judiciary will be involved in here, determining whether a law is constitutional or not. We haven't gotten too much into that discussion yet. But what government agencies do within the bureaucracy is to take the product of Congress and the president, in other words, legislation that's passed, and figure out what actually needs to happen in order to put it into effect. Notably, when we have practical experience with people in government, it's typically with bureaucrats. So when you go to the DMV, for example, you're talking with someone who's employed with the state government, they're a state bureaucrat. If you're receiving government benefits from the federal government and you're trying to figure out your eligibility or how you can collect if you're having issues receiving your benefits, you're going to be interacting with someone working in the bureaucracy. And in general, bureaucrats manage all of these tasks that we think of that government does, like managing prisons, schools, any sort of aid programs like Social Security, healthcare programs like Medicare, all of these things, actually putting them into to practical effect, fall under the purview of the bureaucracy. The term for all this is implementation. Implementation just referring to the process through which policies are executed. How do we go from a law, which is oftentimes vague, sometimes Congress passes legislation without very specific wording as far as what it does. In a practical sense, sometimes they publish laws with just guidelines, for instance, on reducing pollution. And then once it's passed, it's up to the bureaucrats to figure out how to actually institute a set of actions and standards, oftentimes, to get to what the guidelines are that are outlined in the law. So a lot of the task in the bureaucracy is going from general wording and legislation to more specific actions. And the primary means through which this is done is the issuing of what are known as rules. So in the context of the bureaucracy and implementation, the term rules means just at the administrative level determining how the law is going to be implemented and putting forth guidelines to do that. So rules are, as I've just discussed, basically the specifics of how the law that's passed by Congress gets put into effect. The important part here to note is that when an agency issues a rule, it has the effect of law, so it has the ability to then fine people or imprison people or otherwise punish them for breaking this rule. As long as the enforcement mechanisms are consistent with the original law put forth by Congress. And if you're still confused what rules look like, what they do, a few examples maybe would help. Here are some recent instances of rules issued by various departments in government. Here's one dealing with surface coal mining, which goes on in places like, this is talking about Alaska. Some people don't like it because of potential environmental impacts. Obviously, if you're a surface coal miner and your livelihood depends on it, or you're an owner of a firm that does this type of mining, you have interests here. So the rule put forth here is from the Department of the Interior, and as this article outlines, it's basically going to make the guidelines and regulations more strict on these companies that are doing surface coal mining. And you see that in this last paragraph, it's described how this new rule, and this actually set of rules that's being put forth, is derived from a law passed all the way back in 1977, the Surface Mining Control and Regulation Act. So in this, the guise of enforcing this law that's passed by Congress, as it turns out in this case, all the way back in 1977, the Department of the Interior has the ability to put forth this new set of rules, basically increasing the environmental standards associated with this type of mining. Another example that I pulled down from recent news here, this rule issued by Housing and Urban Development says that smoking is prohibited in public housing across the country. So, when living in public housing, if you want to smoke, you've got to go off of the premises to do so from now on. So, first of all, note that the rules here are being issued by the relevant departments. So the public housing rules issued by Housing and Urban Development, the mining rule, the Department of Interior. Also importantly, as I just said, these rules have the force of law. So once this new rule goes into effect for mining, those companies that violate it, if they do so, there will be some punishment in place. When you're dealing with corporations, it's usually going to be monetary punishment. When you're talking about this, there may be punishment in place that's a fine for the people who smoke in their public housing. Maybe they'll be disqualified from living in public housing. So you get a rule here, and then it has the force of law, and oftentimes the issuing departments and agencies will also have enforcement powers. All right, now you're probably thinking, or maybe you aren't, but one potential issue here with rules is that because the agencies have the authority to craft them with a wide degree of leeway as far as what they look like, one issue is, how do we get to these rules? How do we ensure that they're always arrived at in these agencies in a fair and just manner? So the primary way that this is ensured is through various laws that are there that describe the process in detail how it should go. So the agencies don't just have the ability to wake up in the morning and decide we want a new rule to restrict smoking in public housing. There's this a lengthy process they have to go through in order to put it into effect. Notably, beforehand, the rules have to be published so that people can see them and what they're going to be all about. There's a required public comment period such that any affected parties have a means to go out and say how the policy is going to affect them, whether it would be good for them or not, and potentially recommend changes. And after this, if a rule is implemented, the courts also have the authority after the fact, if someone who's affected by the new rule thinks it's illegitimate and not within the guise of any sort of law passed by Congress, they can challenge it in court, and sometimes the plaintiffs succeed, and when the courts rule in their favor, a regulation can be thrown out if it's deemed illegitimate. So I just mentioned this term Federal Register in terms of where the rules are published. So the Federal Register, again, is just It's a set of documents that's published periodically that you can go and read, and it contains all of the various rules and regulations that are in place from the bureaucracy. So probably isn't something that you're going to want to read yourself, given the size. Here, this isn't pages; it's thousands of pages on the y-axis when we're looking for the reference in terms of its size. What's interesting on this chart is over time you can see it starts out relatively small, and it's not until you progress well into the 20th century when the size of the Federal Register and the frequency of all these regulations increases. Specifically starting in the 70s, you see a pretty sharp uptick, before which you had a pretty constant size of the Federal Register dating back several decades. In the 70s, you see a spike. It's a little bit of a downtick here in 81. A lot of you will recognize this as the time when the Reagan administration begins, which is a president who favored deregulation as opposed to increasing regulation. And he was somewhat successful in reducing the prevalence of regulations in government. Going forward, though, you start seeing a bit of an uptick in more recent decades. And for the last few, going back into the 90s a bit, the size of the Federal Register is roughly the same. So we're not really in a period of intense deregulation or anything, but administrations do try to keep it somewhat reasonable so that they're not constantly just adding a bunch of regulations on top of new regulations. Sometimes when there are new regulations that have to be added, there's an explicit goal in place to try to eliminate ones that might be redundant given the new ones. All right, we talked about rules as really the backbone of what the bureaucracy does and how it goes about its implementation tasks. Another really important task for bureaucrats is sometimes they're called on to provide expert advice. So nowadays, this wasn't always the case, but nowadays bureaucrats tend to serve oftentimes in the same department or agencies for a period of decades, sometimes for their entire career. So if you're someone working in a particular area of policy for that long, oftentimes you'll develop a high degree of expertise, which will be useful to the people that are thinking of policy alternatives in that area, new legislation, new ways of implementing or enforcing policy that might be better. So oftentimes bureaucrats are called on to share this advice with the people who are responsible for the new laws of the country. So the GAO, we talked about this in the congressional lecture. This is an office in Congress that's there to help Congress oversee the bureaucracy. So sometimes bureaucrats will report to the GAO, who will then report back to members of Congress. Sometimes bureaucrats go and report directly to Congress through hearings, either in like subcommittees or full committees, standing committees in Congress. Whenever there's a new piece of legislation being contemplated, the department or agency that's going to be tasked with implementing that law, their take on things is going to be useful in crafting the law to be as effective as possible. And one final area of responsibility that falls to the bureaucracy oftentimes involves enforcement and dispute resolution. We've talked about how the bureaucracy has some executive functions in terms of implementing laws. You can think of the rulemaking authority as sort of a quasi-legislative function. There's also some degree of judicial function that falls to the bureaucracy in terms of enforcing all these rules that they put forth, issuing penalties, and providing a means to dispute them and appeal them if someone thinks that they're being treated unfairly. So when an agency or department judges a person, group, business, whatever the entity may be, to be in violation of a rule or regulation, the punishments can sometimes just start with a warning. They can escalate to monetary penalties, which can get quite severe. Sometimes the entity in question will be forced to cease and desist certain activities, which can be harmful to them. So it's important to have in place mechanisms of appeal such that these parties that are affected can go and have an unbiased look at their case, and any grievances that they have can be aired. Oftentimes, obviously, people that are penalized by bureaucratic agencies aren't satisfied with the enforcement and judgment and appeals mechanisms found within these agencies. So another recourse they have is to the court system. Uh, if you are someone who thinks you've been done wrong by a part of the bureaucracy, you can file a case in federal court. This will be heard starting at the lower level in the district courts usually, and go up through the hierarchy of appeals if need be. But the ultimate ruling and outcome of the case, if it's in your favor, you can have the penalties and whatever actions are taken against you in the bureaucracy undone, so you can continue what you're doing. And now that we've talked a lot about what the bureaucracy does, what its functions and tasks are, let's go ahead and talk now about how it's organized. How does it structured to go about all these things that it has to get done? To start with a bit of history, the bureaucracy has changed over time pretty dramatically in a couple of different ways. First of all, there just really wasn't that extensive of a bureaucracy. If you go and look back throughout a lot of the country's history, throughout most of the 19th century, the purview of the federal government wasn't that large, so a really large bureaucracy wasn't necessary. Over time, as the federal government begins to take on more and more responsibilities, in turn, the size of the bureaucracy increases to meet these needs. And you can see that in this chart. Dating back to the beginning of the 19th century, the early 1800s, you can go forward 100 years, and the size of the bureaucracy is still relatively small. It starts to grow a little bit following the Civil War, at a relatively low rate, though. It's only once we get up to the 1930s, and like I've mentioned a few times, this is the point when the federal government really starts to grow in its purview and the responsibilities that it assumes in the economy and other domains of life. And throughout the 20th century, the size of the federal workforce tends to grow at a pretty steady rate. Up till now, we are at roughly 2 million federal employees throughout the various federal departments. So, the growing size of the bureaucracy is worth noting, of course. Also, equally important is how it's composed. So the type of people that are working in the bureaucracy now, not only are there more of them, but they look different than what they would have looked like earlier on in the country's history. What happens is we go from a hiring system called the spoils system or patronage system, as you'll hear it referred to sometimes, and transfer ultimately to a civil service system. So what do these terms mean? So to start out through most of the country's history during that period where the bureaucracy was really small and a larger one wasn't really necessary, the jobs in the federal government are filled out by what's I think most often referred to as a spoils system, though again, patronage system, if you hear that term, it's the same thing. But this is a way of filling out federal jobs that's based not really on qualifications for the job, but mostly on loyalty to a party. So if you're someone who isn't in the same party as the president in power, you're not really going to be eligible for any of these jobs. The more loyal you are to the president and people that are close to him, the more likely you are to be able to land a job. So merit doesn't play too much of a role in this situation, in other words. And while this is a good system for those who get the jobs, they're not expected to do a ton during this period, again, just because the federal government doesn't have too large of a scope itself. It's good for the people that get the jobs. It's not necessarily good for the way the government functions. First of all, there's high turnover rates. Every time you have a new administration come into power, since so many people are appointed for political reasons, they're kicked out with the new administration if it's of a different party, and new political loyalists are put into place. So this sort of retards the growth of expertise within the bureaucracy. People aren't they're not staying in there for decades and careers like they are now. They're just shifting from jobs at a pretty high rate, so no one's really garnering any sort of long-term experience, which you might like in the government. So again, there's not a ton of policy to implement during this period, which is sort of why this system was allowed to be in effect for so long. But obviously it's not, the effect overall is not very good. As we go forward in time, into the 20th century, the government takes on more responsibilities. As I've been saying, this system can no longer work. It's not really practicable anymore to have people who aren't necessarily qualified for these positions getting them and then having responsibilities to implement really important and expansive policies. So eventually, the spoil system gets replaced with what comes to be known as a civil service system. This is what characterizes the federal government today, whereby people working in government are typically there for decades or careers, like I've been saying, so they can develop experience, skill, and expertise within a particular policy area or several policy areas sometimes. This helps them go about their job better, and overall it leads to a better functioning government and bureaucracy. All right, now that we've talked about how the bureaucracy evolves over time in terms of size and composition, let's go ahead and speak now to what does it look like today? What are the various units that compose the bureaucracy? We'll talk about three different types. In particular, first, departments, which are the broadest units in the bureaucracy. Next, independent agencies and regulatory commissions, which are more specialized units, which we'll talk about why they exist. And then finally, government corporations, which again is a more specialized unit than the department. We'll speak to why they're necessary sometimes as well. Okay, so to begin with departments, this is where the vast majority of bureaucracy is located within a department. Currently, we have 15 separate departments. They're all focused on a separate area of policy. There's not really a ton of overlap between what the various departments do. Usually, these are departments housing very many subunits within them, which we'll take a look at in a second. To give you a little bit of background, a department is a unit that isn't really established in the Constitution, but the Congress, along with the President, they can basically establish how many departments they deem necessary. So the most recent was the Department of Homeland Security, formed in the wake of 9/11 in 2002. At this time, the President and Congress viewed the Homeland Security and intelligence situation in the country as inadequate. A lot of these functions dealing with Homeland Security were housed in a lot of separate agencies spread out around the executive branch, and Homeland Security was formed to try to house them in a more compact fashion in such a way that information could be shared across all these various different intelligence communities within the government. A bit more background as far as the various departments in government. Immediately following the ratification of the Constitution, there were in fact only three departments: Treasury, State, and War, which today comes to be known as the Defense Department. So these are, you can think of these as maybe the most critical core functioning departments within the government. Going forward a little bit in time, through the 19th century, there are three more added during the century: Interior, Justice, and Agriculture. So up until the 20th century, you've only got 6 out of the 15 departments we have now already formed. It's during the 20th century where the rise in departments and the overall growth in the bureaucracy sees all these additional ones added. And getting back to this chart, which we went over in the presidency lecture, when we talk about the departments, we're talking about all these listed here. So these are the 15 departments listed here. They're all headed by someone whose title is usually secretary of whatever department. I think everyone has the title of secretary except for the leader of the Justice Department, which is called the Attorney General. But all these people are part of the President's cabinet, which we talked about. Serve some role in advising and reporting to the President as far as sort of the broad state of the executive branch and the federal government goes. However, when you actually look into one of these departments, what's going on is actually quite complex. So here is an outline of the Health and Human Services Department, which, as the name would imply, is a primary part of the bureaucracy that deals with healthcare policy. It's headed by the Secretary of Health and Human Services at the top, and some deputies, some other special officers up here. The structure of the department, though, really involves a lot of different, really more specific subgroups within it. So if you look at this, you've got offices specifically for things like children and family policies, toxic substances. There are a few here. We don't have to go over all of them. Some of these you recognize, like the CDC or the NIH. These are all agencies that are housed within a really broader department that covers, a really large area of policy. Healthcare encompasses a lot of different things, and the structure of the department within it reflects that. All right, so beyond departments, a specialized type of bureaucratic group within the executive branch are independent agencies and regulatory commissions. So oftentimes the function of this type of group is going to be the same as what goes on in the department, just on a smaller scale or a more specific domain. The purpose behind these, though, is to make sure that really sensitive areas of policy aren't influenced by partisan influence or undue influence from Congress or the president, for instance. And to illustrate what we mean by this here, there are some examples of various different independent agencies and regulatory commissions. So the Federal Communications Commission, dealing with communications policy, Environmental Protection Agency, dealing with environmental policy, and of course the FEC, Federal Election Commission, dealing with campaign finance policy and enforcement. So taking the FEC, for example, obviously, in order for our democratic system to function, we need fair elections that aren't biased in favor of one particular party. So the Federal Election Commission, the group in charge of overseeing campaign finance in federal elections, they are there, and they need to be basically free of biases from a president who may be, at any given time, partisan in one direction or another, Congress, the same thing. We want the FEC and groups like this in charge of really sensitive policy areas to basically act in an unbiased manner. So the way this is reflected is if you look at the composition of the FEC, there are 6 board members total. By law, you're required to have a maximum of 3 board members from one particular policy. So in practice, this results in 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats at any given time sitting on the FEC board. So you have an even partisan split there. And in order for any action to be taken in the FEC, it requires a majority of 4 out of 6 of the votes. This means that just the 3 people from one particular party don't have the ability to change policy or enforcement on their own. It requires a minimum degree of bipartisanship to get anything done in there. Also importantly is those serving in the FEC, whereas most parts of the bureaucracy and most officials therein are subject to hiring and firing at the whim of the president, the FEC actually serves a defined term, and the president doesn't have the ability to dismiss them whenever he wants to if they don't act the way he wants. So basically the purpose of this type of body, you've usually got some sort of insulation between the political part of the government and then the regulatory function of an independent agency or commission in order to prevent any sort of undue bias. And one final type of group that's worth mentioning, again, this is one of the less prevalent types of groups within the bureaucracy, is government corporations. These are sometimes brought into effect by the government when there's a particular good or service that the government believes is necessary to provide, but they're not particularly confident that actors in the private market will provide it absent government intervention. So, for example, Amtrak. This is, as you all probably know, a corporation that provides long-distance train passenger travel throughout the United States. It's not a particularly lucrative market in the private sector, so there's not really much commercial viability for it. Most people would prefer to fly long distances, but for better or worse, the federal government determines that they want to maintain passenger rail travel in the United States, and so they support Amtrak. And even though Amtrak loses money every year, the federal government deems it worth it because they want to continue having this service provided. Similarly, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, this is a corporation, excuse me. This is a group that insures deposits. Whenever you put money in the bank up to $100,000, it's insured in case the bank somehow manages to lose it. Basically, this is put into place in the wake of some of the bank runs in the Great Depression, which really destabilized the financial industry. It's there to basically increase confidence in deposits. Corporation for Public Broadcasting, this is the group that provides funding for PBS, NPR, where we've got, obviously plenty of broadcasting outlets in terms of radio or TV, but PBS and NPR provide a certain type of content that the government deems worthy, that they don't think would otherwise maybe be provided in the private sector. So far we've talked about what the bureaucracy does, how it's structured, some history, what does it look like now in terms of the various units within the bureaucracy. Let's get into now what are some potential issues that prevent it from sometimes effectively carrying out its role. One thing to note is that bureaucrats, though sometimes people tend to speak of them as in a dehumanizing manner, they are human beings. They have their own interests and sensibilities sometimes, and as it so happens, there are cases sometimes when they don't align with those of the president or Congress. This can become a problem sometimes because we've talked about the civil service system, whereby these people are serving careers as civil servants. They're gaining a lot of expertise and sometimes influence over particular areas of policy. So when they have their own interests at play, where they want to influence policy in one direction, and it's not necessarily in the same direction as the president or whatever, Congress also, for example, this is called a principal agent problem, where the principal in this case is the person or group who's supposed to be in charge, either the president or Congress, the agent being the bureaucrat or group of bureaucrats in a particular policy domain. We can think of a couple different types of principal agent problems that might be in effect sometimes in the bureaucracy. One being slack, where it's not necessarily a case of the bureaucracy going against the interests of the principal, but just maybe not working as hard as Congress or the president would like in pursuit of their goals. So people sometimes don't work as hard as their bosses want them to. In other words, another case would be drift, where people in the bureaucracy are working sufficiently hard, just maybe not in the direction that the president or Congress wants them to go. So if you've got a new administration coming in, they want to make sure that those who are holdovers in the bureaucracy from previous administrations, that they'd see if there's desired policy changes, that they actually get reflected in the actions of the bureaucracy, and that you don't have this drift problem emerging. Maybe a more insidious issue in the bureaucracy is that sometimes there are cases where, even though we think of the federal government and all of its components as there to make life better for people in the United States and to serve the people, sometimes it becomes the case that bureaucrats can begin serving more specialized interests that aren't necessarily consistent with the general interests of the people. So again, people who are working for years and years in one policy area, this often has the effect of having them come into close contact frequently with the same industries or groups or representatives. Maybe if you're working in the agricultural department, you talk with the same cattle lobby pretty often, or corn lobby, something like this. And sometimes you can just maybe lose perspective and not really be able to put yourself into the shoes of the general public that much and what would be best for them. Sometimes a more malevolent issue would be if you get into quid pro quo situations where it gets to like a you scratch my back and I'll scratch your back and treat me favorably with policies that I want. In exchange, I'll do something that benefits you personally. This is obviously a big problem when it does pop up. And as far as a less intentionally destructive but sometimes equally problematic situation, the bureaucracy can tend to be inefficient. This is one common complaint that people have about the bureaucracy. As I said at the outset, this is the part of government that people most often interact with, and oftentimes you'll hear terms thrown about like red tape to describe these interactions, where you know you want something that you think is sufficient to be done within whatever agency or department you're interacting with, and for some reason it just takes too long and there's too many steps. So this is due to a couple of different things. One approach some people take is just to say, the bureaucrats are incompetent or lazy or whatever. This probably isn't the whole story. Their task is quite difficult when you think of all the different laws that are on the books that need to be enforced. It's really not an easy job to get them all done in an efficient manner. This is often compounded, too, by the fact that elected officials can sometimes make their job difficult by making redundant policy. So passing laws and giving responsibilities over certain policies to a department or an agency that exists over there, when there's already an agency department over here that's been doing the same thing already. So this has the effect of making people jump through more than one hoop to get something done. And so the bureaucracy can be inefficient, but it's not just human frailty that leads to it. It's the structure of what's going on, and oftentimes unintended consequences of what Congress does and what they task the bureaucracy with doing. So given that there are these various types of problems that have the potential to reduce the effectiveness and the efficiency of the bureaucracy, let's conclude now with discussing what can be done to try to alleviate them. At a basic level, we've talked about how, first of all these bureaucratic positions, at least the high-level ones, are appointments made by the president. Also, Congress, of course, has a say in this. The president appoints these high-level positions. The Congress, the Senate specifically, has the ability to give their input and either accept or reject them. So at this stage, Congress and the president jointly, they can alleviate some of the issues in the bureaucracy, first of all, by appointing qualified people who can do their job well in these high-level secretary positions and other positions of the bureaucracy. This is especially important as far as Slack, getting people inspired, getting them to work in an effective manner. We talked about drift as well in our discussion of the principal-agent problems. Drift is important to alleviate by making sure that people that are appointed are ideologically compatible with you. So if you're a Republican, you don't really want to appoint someone who's a really strong Democrat and expect that they're going to work to fulfill your policy agenda. Same thing with if you're a Democrat president, you don't want to appoint a strong Republican at a really important policy position because odds are that they're going to try to impose their own ideology in the department rather than reflect your own. Beyond just having good workers, smart people, competent people, people that agree with your outlook on government in these key positions, an additional way that Congress and the president can direct the bureaucracy and incentivize them to do a good job is through budgets. So we talked in the congressional lecture how every year there has to be an appropriations bill passed in order to fund the entire government, basically. And so Congress, along with the president, as they go about crafting this bill, they have the option to give departments and agencies more money. They can take money away. And you have this in the back of your mind when you're working in these departments. You want more money. You don't want to have your budget reduced because that really eliminates a lot of your ability to carry out your job. Sometimes this will personally affect people's compensation within these departments and their quality of their workplace quality. So one really persistent incentive to do a good job is just the looming threat that every year your budget has to be renewed, and if you drop below a certain threshold of quality in your work, there's a possibility that you could see a budget cut. Next, oversight is a term, I think, again, one that we've used before in a lot of the lectures. The Congress and the President, part of their authority is to oversee what's going on in the bureaucracy, to make sure, through the monitoring and supervision, that what they're doing is consistent with the law and done in an efficient manner. We've talked about how oftentimes Congress will hold hearings where certain members in the bureaucracy will be called on to come in. Sometimes they're just routine to say, what's going on in your department, how are things going. Other times they'll be in response to specific events that are going on. If something happens that concerns Congress within a particular agency or department, they can call a hearing specifically to ask people that are in charge what's going on. There are also a number of laws in place that have been passed through Congress that are designed to make the bureaucracy run better. Let's walk through a few of them. First of all, the Sunshine Law. This requires that agency meetings, when possible, be held in public. There's one exception as far as classified information being shared. If there's a meeting where there's sensitive intelligence being discussed, it obviously won't be made public. The purpose here is obvious, though, right? There's less likelihood of malfeasance if what the people in the bureaucracy are doing is made public, and people in the public who are interested have a better ability to go and look at what's going on in these agencies and determine whether it's to their liking or not. Another law that maybe you guys have heard of before, the Freedom of Information Act. This is an act that makes pretty much any document within the government available to the public if they request it. Again, with the exception that sensitive classified information obviously isn't going to be publicized. Again, the intent here is pretty clear. You're not going to be doing things that are potentially untoward, or at least you're less likely to be doing them if you know that your correspondence with other people in the government maybe could reveal what's going on to the public. This is I guess just to get briefly into recent political history, this is was a big subject of controversy in the recent presidential election, and Hillary Clinton's potential going around the Freedom of Information Act through her private email server, but we don't need to get really too much into detail on that, but people do take this type of thing seriously if there's even the appearance of trying to get around these transparency laws. Finally, the Whistleblower Protection Act. This is another important one. This is aimed at people who are within an agency or wherever in whatever group in the bureaucracy, and they think that they see something going on that shouldn't be going on. Normally, you might be afraid to report it up the chain of command because there's loyalty within these organizations. You might be afraid that you're going to get demoted, passed over for a promotion, or fired, maybe even for rocking the boat. This act is there in place to say that if you become a whistleblower, in other words, you report something that's concerning you, you can't be punished for it. So the incentive here again is obvious that you're more likely to come forward given that there are protections for you. Let's talk now about a reform option that's available specifically to the president. So in our lecture about the president, we talked about these concentric circles around him. So starting with the White House staff, farther out the executive office of the president, and then farthest out the cabinet, where most of the bureaucracy is held. So one option that's available to the president, by virtue of the fact that he controls the positioning of all these different policies and organizations within the executive branch, is he can try to move some policy domains, if need be, out of the departments and into the executive office of the president. So if there's, usually this is going to be dealing with a really specific type of policy and not something as broad as an entire department, but if there's something really specific going on in like the energy department that the president wants to pay a lot more specific attention to, he can either form an additional office within the EOP or take authority entirely out of that department and put it into the executive office of the president. And so when this is the case, because the executive office of the president is so much smaller and so much closer to the president than these cabinet departments are, the president can exert a more direct line of influence and be more abreast of what's going on there. Another option available jointly to Congress and the president, sometimes agencies could just be eliminated. Sometimes this will occur just naturally, like if there's an area of policy that's no longer really warranting an entire agency focus on it. It will oftentimes be eliminated. Sometimes one agency will be merged with another to either reduce redundancy or just otherwise, if they think things can be run more efficiently by reducing the number of agencies. Sometimes, though, agencies can just be eliminated because they're not working out, and the president or Congress wants to try putting responsibility for this policy domain somewhere else in the executive branch. In fact, when you look at the numbers, about 60% of all agencies created between 1946 and 97 end up eliminated by 2000. Probably most of these are, like I said, due to natural causes, death by either eliminated redundancy or the policy area is no longer relevant. However, this is a tool, again, just to get rid of something that's not working overall. Finally, a pretty controversial reform option is privatization. So, taking a function of implementation or enforcement of a policy out of the hands of the government bureaucracy and putting it up to market forces in the private sector. So this would be something like, for example, prisons. A lot of states have run into problems paying for all the people that they've incarcerated in the prisons. We're the most imprisoned country on earth, and so this drives up costs a lot. In the pursuit of more efficient cost management, a lot of states have contracted out their prison management and said, we'll pay these private firms who have their privately run prisons however much money per prisoner. And generally, these would be cheaper than what the government can do on its own. So this has a positive effect of reducing some of the budgetary burden. Although, again, these are privatization is usually controversial. There's questions as to the morality and the ethics of it, the effectiveness of doing so in other regards. Usually, when we talk about privatization, this is something that's going to be favored by Republicans pretty frequently, and with equal frequency, disfavored by Democrats. Alright, so that is the end of the bureaucracy lecture. The final lecture in this unit prior to the next test will be the judiciary, so I'll see you then.